34th Legislature in Guam is now called to order. For the prayer, can I ask Senator Estevez to kindly lead us?
Please rise. Heavenly Father, we ask that you guide this body, its members, and those who support it in the pursuit of thought, in the pursuit and the goals of achieving what we each individually believe is the best for this island. We also ask that you protect and bless our families that support us every day in this endeavor, through the long nights, the long hours, as we do this work for the people, as we fulfill the goals that we set out to do. And we also ask, Lord, that you bless the people of Guam in these times of uncertainty, and always look after us as we move along and as we praise your name. And we ask this through Christ our Lord, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Supposed to mention that moment of silence.
For the recognition of the recipient of a Minaladan Mastakilina Sacrificio, I ask Senator Argentine.
On behalf of a grateful island and country, we honor United States Navy Steward Mate 3, Felix Taekwenko Agigi, and the family of United States Navy Steward Mate 3, Felix Taekwenko Agigi, for making the ultimate sacrifice in service and defense of our island and country.
For the inauguration.
Gininimas takulu, gihina soku, imas takulum gikorasonhu, zanimas figu nani nasinahu, who ofrecen maisazu, barabahu pretehi, zanhu defendi, ihinengi, ikutura, ilengwahi, I airi, I hanum, zanitanu tamoro. Ni retsaku, diretsu gininazu stata. Esti huafirma gihilo I Biblia, zani banderan banderahu, I banderan guaha.
Senator Moynihan, would please lead us in song. clerk would please take the roll.
Senator Atta. Senator Uggan. Senator Castro. Speaker Cruz.
Present.
Senator Espaldon. Senator Esteves. Senator Lee. Senator Morrison. Senator Muñoz. Senator Nelson. Senator Rodriguez. Senator San Augustine. Senator San Nicolas. Vice Speaker Talahi. Senator Torres. Mr. Speaker, there is a quorum.
Thank you. Mr. Majority Leader, you're recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I move to approve the Legislative Journal dated June 26, 2017, subject to corrections.
There's a motion to approve the Legislative Journal dated June 26, 2017, subject to corrections. Hearing no objections, motion carries. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, there are communications and petitions, and I move that they be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion that communications and petitions be appended to today's session journal, hearing no objection, motion carries. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, there are messages from Imagalahin Guahan, and I move that they be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion that messages from Imagalahin Guahan be appended to today's journal, hearing no objections, motion carries. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, there are reports of standing committees, and I move that they also be appended to today's session journal.
On the motion that reports of standing committees be appended to today's journal, hearing no objections, so ordered. Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, there are no reports of select committees. Mr. Speaker, I move that bills introduced, bills number 135-34 LS through 137-34 LS and Bill 138-34 COR through Bill 153-34 COR, resolutions introduced, resolutions number 160-34 LS through 161-34 LS, and resolution 162-34 COR through 167-34 COR. Certificates introduced, certificates numbers 98 through 34 LS through certificate 102-34 LS, and certificates 103-34 COR through 113-34 COR, that they be deemed to have been given their first reading.
On that motion, hearing no objections, Mr. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move to excuse senators not present for today's legislative session.
On the motion to excuse members not present, hearing no objection.
And I move that all congratulatory, commendatory, and condolence resolutions and legislative certificates introduced today and for the remainder of this legislative session be considered first read and adopted to allow the legal counsel to make technical corrections and to add all senators as co-sponsors.
On the motion, hearing no objection, motion carries.
Mr. Speaker, I move to place the following from the Committee on may I go ahead and ask the respective committee chairs to make their motions to put their nominees on?
Whichever.
Okay. So for the Committee on Guam U.S. Military Buildup, Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, Majority Leader. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move for the placement of the nomination of Mr. David J. Aarons to serve as a member of the Guam Regional Transit Authority Board of Trustees with a recommendation to do confirm on the legislative agenda, please, or the voting file.
On that motion, hearing no objection. Do you have another one?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Committee on Guam, U.S. Military Build-Up, Infrastructure, and Transportation hereby reports out the nomination of Melanie R. Mendiola to serve as a member of the Guam Port Authority Board of Trustees with a recommendation to do confirm, and I move to have it placed in the voting file, Mr. Speaker.
Hearing no objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the same Committee on Guam, U.S. Military Build-Up, Infrastructure, and Transportation hereby reports out the nomination of Maria D.R. Taitanu to serve as a member of the Guam Port Authority Board of Directors with a recommendation to do confirm, and I'd like to move for his placement in the voting file, please.
Hearing no objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Madam Vice Speaker.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker and colleagues. I'd like to move for that the appointment of Rebecca A.R. Duenas to serve as Chamorro Culture Representative to the Guam Historic Preservation Review Board be placed on the voting file.
Hearing no objection. Housing? Mr. Chairman.
Yes. So from the Committee on Housing, Utilities, Public Safety, and Homeland Security, reports out the nomination of Rosanna Villagomez-Uggan to serve as a member of the Guam Housing Corporation Board of Directors with a recommendation to do confirm to be placed in the voting file.
Hearing no objection.
And we are now in consent calendar.
On the second reading file, I believe the first bill on the agenda, Senator Snicklish, you're recognized on Bill 38-34.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a motion to place Bill 38-34 in the third reading file and be afforded an opportunity to speak on the measure.
Hearing no objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Bill 38-34 is an act to amend Section 6229.2 and 6229.3 of Article 2 and Section 6301 of Article 3, each of Chapter 6, Title 4 Guam Code annotated, relative to requiring that all salary and or class specification appeals be administratively adjudicated before a 3-year review of salary and or class specifications for nurses and other public employees be conducted. The purpose of this bill, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that before we go out and do any other wage studies, we first have to administratively adjudicate all of the previous grievances from any prior studies. And the reason why we're introducing this measure to amend this section of the law, Mr. Speaker, is because we don't want to be layering a second study on top of one that has not been properly adjudicated for the employees. So, for example, we have a lot of educators in the Department of Education who are unhappy with how the previous wage study was implemented with respect to how they were slotted and with respect to how their salaries were adjusted compared to other employees who had less experience. So a lot of these employees who are veterans felt that the raises that they got that were pennies in the dollar were not equitable to the raises that their less experienced colleagues got that were much larger. And so with all of these complaints that were filed, it became very evident that before you go out and do another study on top of one that hasn't been fully remedied, we need to remedy it first. And the reason is because when an organization comes in and does a wage study, they do it not just looking at the positions, but also on the basis of where they currently are at. And so if where employees currently are at is something that is not adjudicated, then the next study could basically be validating the work of the previous study that technically was not fully adjudicated because the grievances were not properly addressed. When we introduced this bill, Mr. Speaker, it was back in March of 2017. I do understand that there may have been some progress on the administrative adjudication of some of these grievances, but that only underscores the fact that having this in public law would not be a detriment to the process. It would be a good idea for us to make sure that before we go out and do any additional wage studies, the current study and all of any and all of the grievances that were filed with respect to it was properly administratively adjudicated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the motion, any senator wish to be heard? Senator Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The concept of the bill is certainly something that is not, it's not something that I object to, but I do have some reservations about the legislative intent. And even in listening to the mover of this bill, because in reading the committee report, what comes to mind is that what is listed here in the legislative intent is in contrast to the testimony that was provided by the Department of Administration. Specifically, the department in their testimony in a letter dated April the 13th, 2017, discusses that they have addressed all matters. They've responded to all formal inquiries and any formal concerns that were filed to them. So I'm not so sure that we are addressing a situation that is actually a situation that has not been remedied. And if I may, if the mover of this bill, the author, would so yield, I would like to hear from him how he reconciles the testimony where they're from Department of Administration that that states that they've taken care of all matters, and from my simple read, it appears that they've adjudicated all matters. I'm not sure that we are actually addressing a need through this bill, or if a need actually exists to go down this road.
Do you yield?
I do, Mr. Speaker, and thank you. I want to address this measure through public law from a variety of perspectives. The first is that while the Department of Administration in their April letter, which was subsequent to the introduction of this bill in March, does state that they have remedied the grievances. That doesn't mean that it's a matter of public law. There could be a study 10, 20, 30 years from now over the course of all that time, and there could be issues that are not administratively adjudicated. And so maybe they have been done so now, but that does not mean that they're going to be done so in the future, because it's not written into the law. The second thing that we need to be mindful of, Mr. Speaker, is that while the Department of Administration may say that they've administratively adjudicated them, the grieving parties may feel that they have further remedy, and they may want to take it a step further. And so while we may not necessarily have outstanding grievances in DOA, it does not mean that they have not been fully adjudicated. Administrative adjudication does not stop at the Department of Administration if they want to take it a step further. And so if they decide to, then this law will ensure that we're not going to be layering an additional study on top of something that has not seen its full due process. And so, Mr. Speaker, I think that while we may be getting testimony from DOA to the contrary, I think it's necessary that we codify it. We make it a matter of public law, so that maybe there may not be an issue right now of DOA because they've remedied it, albeit so many years later. I think many of us here who are familiar with the previous wage study know that it took years for this to get addressed. And so prior to us doing any additional studies, we need to make sure that any grievances are fully adjudicated as a matter of public law. So I think codifying it would do no harm if there is no outstanding issues to be concerned about.
Senator Torres, is that satisfactory, or does that address your concern?
Well, I guess it does, Mr. Speaker, address my concern about whether we're dealing with a situation right now. I guess this is a legislative that's intended to be prospective in nature. But I do want to, if the author may also yield, I do have a question with regard to DOA's position that this might adversely impact those agencies that are not directly affected or covered under the Competitive Wage Act. In that statement in the April 13th letter, there was a suggestion that it will adversely impact those other agencies not covered by the Competitive Wage Act, and I just want to get clarification from the author that that may be an unforeseen consequence, or we certainly don't want those agencies to be collateral damage if that isn't true. In fact, a correct assessment by DOA. So if the author may yield to that other point, I would appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, and I think it's important for us to kind of separate out the two. The Competitive Wage Act is the most recent study that has resulted in many grievances, but this bill does not speak specifically to the Competitive Wage Act, nor is it meant to be mutually exclusive to general line agencies versus semi-autonomous or autonomous agencies. What this bill is intending to do is to make sure that no wage studies take place until all grievances for any agencies are administratively adjudicated. So whether you're an agency that's been affected by the Competitive Wage Act, or you're an agency whose wages are set outside of the Competitive Wage Act, regardless of what agency is trying to do a study, we should not be going out and doing a study and trying to adjust wages when we have outstanding grievances on the existing plan that have not been remedied. So while the letter from the Department of Administration says that other agencies may be adversely impacted, I actually say that other agencies need to be included. I think throughout this government, we should not be doing any wage studies until we're absolutely certain that the existing concerns of the existing pay scales have already been addressed.
Anything further, Senator Torres? Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? On the main motion, 38. Oh, Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too support the intent of this bill. However, I am also concerned about the letter from the Department of Administration. She points out several areas that were not, these concerns by DOA were not addressed in the committee report. I'm just not feeling confident that we've narrowed down the language to not be as broad. She cautioned us against the language being broad, that it would stop any type of salary review based on any appeal, not just appeals pursuant to the CWA. And as pointed out earlier, the CWA appeals, the DOA director pointed out, those have all been resolved as of today. According to her letter, those were resolved in June 2016. So there are no CWA outstanding appeals. So the appeals that might be outstanding are appeals regarding particular descriptions of, what does she say? Reclassification reviews that could be requested at any time and pursuant to law prior to the CWA. And so in her words, she says, since appointing authorities or employees can request for such review at any time, no compensation reviews will ever be carried out because our department could receive requests throughout the year, every year. If this bill were to become law in its current form, our department would not be able to conduct a compensation review for any government positions, such as nurses, teachers, police officers, firefighters, nor any difficult to recruit positions. This could have an adverse effect on the government's ability to hire, hamper critical services provided to the public, since, etc. She also says that there's language in here that that mandates DOA to settle the classification and salary appeals that are outstanding prior to any compensation reviews, and that this might create an expectation that there's a resolution in the eyes of the employees, or an expectation that the appeal would be in favor of them. She points out that the language is, she says, global, may have a more global effect since it seeks to include the requirement of the administrative adjudication of salary appeals in the compensation policy pursuant to 6301. And here she talks about that this may impact then current semi-autonomous or autonomous agencies that are already allowed to do their own salary reviews, that this would now bring them back into those reviews being done by DOA. I think that's what she's saying. That's how I'm interpreting this. And so she suggested that instead the legislature look at when they resolved the 26 or all the appeals under the CWA, they sent out a request for review findings. And she says in those findings under the CWA, they had recommended that some positions be adjusted to a higher pay grade, and that those still remain unresolved pending, it looks to me, pending availability and authorization of funds. That's what her findings are. That's what they're informing. That's what they're telling the employees, it sounds to me. So unfortunately, this bill doesn't address those review findings, and that if there were adjustments to be made or that DOA has found need to be made pursuant to the CWA, we're not necessarily addressing those. So I am concerned, and I agree that all appeals pursuant to a certain compensation study should be completed before we do a new compensation study. But it just looks to me like the bill hasn't been amended to address her concerns. So the current language is perhaps more broad than it needs to be, unless we're trying to address every appeal available to a government employee as to their classification, and not necessarily appeals pursuant to the recent CWA. If that's the case, I mean, I would support this bill if it was narrowed to reviews of appeals pursuant to compensation studies that they're required to do every 3 years. Any appeals pursuant to that must be, of course, resolved prior to the new compensation study. And as of today, it looks like that is the case. So all appeals pursuant to the previous CWA have been resolved, and we are ready to move on with the next review of our salaries. But so I would ask that I guess I can't stand totally in support of this bill at this moment, Mr. Speaker, because I feel like we have not resolved the DOA's concerns, and we should, if that's the intent of the bill, try to narrow it down for that purpose. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Any other senator wish to be heard on the bill? On the main motion, 38-34. Did you wish to make any amendments, Madam Vice Speaker, to address your concern? Okay. Any other member wish to be heard on the main motion? If not, Senator Espaldon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too have read the letter from the Director of the Department of Administration, and the colleagues who have spoken previously have basically addressed those concerns. But just to expound on one more point in terms of unintended consequences, and not that I disagree with what the author is trying to do, but there would be some unintended consequences, because if there is, and one of the points that the director points out is, bottom line, the term salary appeals is not necessarily defined. And if there is a salary appeal, and this is just my own thinking, that goes before, I don't know, I guess the Civil Service Commission or whoever it may be the proper authority, since if it has not been resolved, even if it's unfair or to the government, there is the possibility that an unintended consequence could arise, in that if you just keep this appeal in the process, then you hold the government Guam, a new study, from being held, and so Gov Guam would be held hostage. And I think that's not the correct way. So I agree with the previous speakers that perhaps we need to narrow down the process to address just the Wage Act and go down that road. But this bill does not do that. Like I said, the concern really is for the unintended consequences, that one case could hold up and hold hostage the entire government's future wage studies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? If not, the sponsor is welcome to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate the feedback from my colleagues. I would like to propose some amendments then to the bill, hoping to be able to narrow it down so that we're able to address some of the concerns. On page 2, lines 26 to 27, the portion there that has an underline, upon administrative adjudication of all salary appeals, I'd like to, after the word appeals, add the words of any prior compensation study.
Please repeat.
After the word appeals on page 2, line 27, add the words of any prior compensation study. And so it would read, upon administrative adjudication of all appeals of any prior compensation study. So it would limit it to the previous implemented compensation plan.
On that amendment, on the amendment offered by Senator Nicholas, any senator wish to be heard? Senator Torres.
If I may clarify, the amendment is to page 2, line 27, to read, upon administrative adjudication of all salary appeals of any compensation study. Is that correct?
I believe prior.
Now, my question then would, are we really accomplishing anything differently? Because I would imagine that regardless of whether it's the Compensation Wage Act or another agency that is not subject to the Compensation Wage Act, for example, they do in fact go through some sort of a study, as I'm aware. At least I'm aware of 2 or 3 agencies that have a compensation study. So I don't know that we're really accomplishing anything different with this amendment. And please, if I'm reading it incorrectly, can you inform me? Because I just don't see the point.
Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the concerns, I understand there are several concerns. The first, and I think the most prevalent one, is the fact that we want to make sure that we're not having any random appeal holding up a process. From what I'm hearing from the retiring speakers, her concern is how this may extend to other agencies. But again, I would like to reiterate that I believe we should apply this measure to all agencies, regardless of whether they are line agencies, autonomous or semi-autonomous agencies. What this one amendment would do is it would limit the administrative adjudication to any appeals related specifically to the study. So, for example, if someone is protesting a reclassification or an increment, that would not necessarily hold up a second study. But if somebody is protesting how they were slotted or what their particular step increase was as a result of a prior study, that would need to be administratively adjudicated. And so by putting this language in there, we're still affecting all agencies, but we're limiting the effect to that where the appeals need to now only be narrow in scope with respect to them being related only to the study and not necessarily to any other wage-related grievances that may be outstanding.
Anything further, Senator Torres? On the amendment? Any objection to the amendment? Continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In line of that amendment, I'd like to proffer a second amendment on page 3, line 11. Also, after the word appeals, add the words of any prior compensation study.
On that amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Any objection? Any senator wish to be heard? Senator Espaldon.
This amendment now is the same amendment that was proffered to the previous section. And basically it's to section 62229.3 headed class specifications 3-year review. The previous section was salary schedule 3-year review. And this reads, the Director of Administration in collaboration with the Government of Guam agencies, nursing administrators, shall update the class specifications pertaining to studies, requirements, and experience of all nursing classifications. Upon administrative adjudication of all class specification appeals of any prior compensation study, the class specification shall be reevaluated every 3 years, and changes shall be made as indicated. Again, Mr. Speaker, I respect what the author and the mover of the amendment is trying to do, but I still raise concerns about the unintended consequences of this, in that if there is perhaps an employee, a GovGuam employee, who is not satisfied with where they have been slotted in terms of their class specifications, it could hold up the whole updating and reclassifications for even nurses and other critical positions. And I have, a concern about that, because this process of finally adjudicating that appeal could go on for some time. And so if there really is a mandate in our laws to every 3 years do the review, just one appeal that has not been adjudicated could hold up that whole process. And even if it's just based upon any prior compensation study, we're not talking specifically about the latest one, we're talking about any. So if somebody has a grievance or wants to bring up the process, an appeal for their specific situation, again, it could hold the whole process up for all the hundreds, if not thousands, of GovGuam employees who probably deserve to have their classification and their salary be reviewed. I don't object to it, but I'm still not sure that I can support this bill. But thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator on the amendment? Any objection to the amendment? Senator Snickles, you still have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And then on page 3, line 21, after the word appeals, a similar amendment to add the words of any prior compensation study. And just to address some of the concerns that were raised, Mr. Speaker, there's another sentence right after this one that we're amending. And the sentence reads, internal equity should be reviewed annually and external competitiveness at least every 3 years. What we're amending here, Mr. Speaker, is a process that happens every 3 years. If we are not administratively adjudicating wage study appeals within a 3-year time frame, that is a government problem. That is a government problem. We should not be going 3 years and still not resolving a salary appeal that's related to a prior study. On top of that, Mr. Speaker, while the argument can be made that we're holding up the process for everybody, at the same time we're protecting everybody. We're protecting everybody from a bad study being layered on top of another bad study, potentially. It would be a huge disservice for us to not make sure that before we take our next step, our feet are already firmly planted on our current position. So these amendments are intending to narrow down that broad scope, because I do understand the concern that maybe somebody is complaining about how they were reclassified, or they're complaining that their increment was not what it was supposed to be, and it could have just been some kind of administrative error. And just because of the sheer size of government, these administrative errors could be all these small fires that are just constantly not put out, and they may hold back the process. But by narrowing it, this language, by limiting it to the prior study, we are now aligning everything. And so if we're not able to administratively adjudicate a prior wage study appeal within 3 years, then definitely I think all the GovGuam employees should be screaming about that. Because in the end, all for one and one for all, and if we are going to be a victim today, someone else is going to be a victim tomorrow to a government that can't get its act together in 3 years. So I think that this measure is not only appropriate, but it's aligned with what's in the best interests of the island and the people of Guam, to include all of the employees. And so I'd like to proffer that amendment on page 3, line 21, to add after the word appeals, the words of any prior compensation study.
Where would you like that, on page 3?
Page 3, line 21, after the word appeals.
On that amendment? Any objection? Hearing none.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And lastly, I'd like to strike section 2.
On the motion to strike section 2, the legislative intent, any objection?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the motion to send the bill down to the voting file, I'm sorry, Senator Estevez?
Mr. Speaker, it's still too late to speak on the bill before it goes to the voting file. If I may. Mr. Speaker, thank you for the opportunity. I do agree with the initial intent of the bill and what it proceeds to do. I'm still undecided, though, on where I stand. I do share concerns about holding up the entire process for all of government. And in applying some foresight and some things that have happened historically, not only within this body, but our government as a whole, is if, let's say, just one class specification and not even just one particular case is not adjudicated in a timely fashion, then it's holding up the entirety of GovGuam. And we run into the potential where we start going backwards and forwards, where all one class needs to do, whether you're a teacher or firefighter, is go to your Godzu senator and have them pass legislation to bypass the entire compensation process. And so in holding up this process, we run the risk of going back to that, which is was the entire purpose of the competitive wage study and the entire purpose of the triennial reevaluation. I think there are other ways we can do to better move this process forward. And I do agree that the adjudication process needs to happen. But this is exactly why we have oversight and to push in other methods. I can't get behind the idea that this is necessarily to protect the government as a whole, because I think holding back the majority to adjudicate a handful of cases, whether they have merit or they don't, I think is a detriment to the process as a whole. Because what we've seen happen is we've gone decades for classified employees or government of Guam employees in order to have a wage study done or have any type of adjustments. And while you've had larger blocks, well, let's just be honest, political blocks that have had the oomph to get their salaries adjudicated, what about the little guys? What about the guys over at Parks and Recs? What about the customs officers? What about the guys at Department of Agriculture? Because they're smaller blocks, but is the value they bring to our government any less important? And so again, I only caution that as we move forward with this, with the appearance of us applying a check and balance in the present, is that we create problems for our government in the future by taking a couple of steps backwards. So again, while I agree with what this intends to do, I'm just not yet sold that it's going to accomplish that, having a detrimental effect to the government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the motion to send the bill to the voting file, hearing, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd assumed that I was afforded the opportunity to close previously, but I guess I'll take the opportunity now. First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, adding this simple language will not take any step backward. As a matter of fact, since the passage of the Competitive Wage Act, measures have been introduced by members of this body to go in and affect salary adjustments. So doing this and requiring appeals to be adjudicated will not in any way prevent politicians from being able to do that. I think that the only watchdog we have for that is our media and our public, who pays very close attention to the work that we do. I think actually, Mr. Speaker, that contrary to the retiring speaker's assertions, this measure actually protects the little guy, because you will be safe in due process if that is where you're going to be turning to in order to try and make sure that you're getting remedy. The little guy may not be able to, go and get the help they want politically, but they definitely have due process. And due process includes things like the Civil Service Commission and everything else in between that makes up the ability for somebody to go out and get justice. What this bill will do is it will say, we're not going to steamroll past you and ignore your appeal because we want to just move everything forward for everybody else. We're going to stop and we're going to make sure that your concerns are going to be addressed before we go out and do everything and change everything wholesale. And the reason why that's so important, Mr. Speaker, is because we just don't want to keep layering bad studies on top of bad outcomes. That's not good practice. At what point are we going to say, hey, you know what, yeah, we should make sure that we did everything right before we do it all over again? It's just not good practice. So with this measure, Mr. Speaker, with these amendments...
Point of information, Mr. Speaker. Just to clarify, my position was that us as politicians should not be in the business of arbitrarily adjusting pays for different classifications, as that we try to protect the integrity of compensation studies now and in the future. And I just wanted to make that clarification.
You may continue.
Just a point of personal privilege, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
In my prior statements of my amendments, that was my closing. The retiring speaker was afforded an opportunity to break our decorum and to speak after I closed. And so I was then afforded an opportunity by you, Mr. Speaker, to address his issues. And his interruption is once again out of decorum. So I just wanted to rise as a point of personal privilege that we should be respecting the decorum of this floor.
Thank you.
In my closing, Mr. Speaker, I just want to reiterate that if we're going to be making sure that the administrative adjudication of all salary appeals of any prior compensation study is done before we go out and do another study, we're going to make sure that we fixed all of the mistakes before we go out and do it all over again. And by doing that, Mr. Speaker, there may be circumstances where the government's going to say, hey, you know what? We want to do this, but we can't because we need to fix these things. And that's okay. That's actually healthy, Mr. Speaker, because in so doing that, we're going to learn that, hey, you know what? We can't screw it up this way. We can't screw it up that way. And then eventually we'll start getting it right all across the board. And then that's even less time for us having to have individual groups go out and appeal. That's even less time for things to be getting stuck in the Civil Service Commission. By forcing this government to make sure we get it right before we move on, we prevent a lot of waste. And that, Mr. Speaker, is something that we need to be mindful of when considering the measures that we move forward in this body. And so I humbly ask my colleagues to please support Bill 38-34 so we can make sure that we're fixing that bad practice when it comes to the implementation of our wage studies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
On the motion to send the bill down to the voting file, Senator Morrison, you're recognized on 49-94.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I motion to place Bill 49-34 as substituted by the Committee of Environment, Agriculture, Land, and Procurement Reform as your third reading file. I'd like to briefly speak on.
Any objection? You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 public hearings were held on Bill 49 with testimonies provided by the General Service Administration, Guam Department of Education, Guam Housing and Urban Renewal Authority, and from Attorney John Thomas Brown. The recommendations of these entities, which included the deletion of certain sections, as well as the adoption of a much-needed language, were considered were a result of testimony provided during the first and second public hearings on Bill 49. The substitute version of Bill 49 adjusts the small purchase threshold from $15,000 to $25,000 for goods and services, and from $50,000 to $100,000 for construction. Not only do the new thresholds closely reflect the recommendations of our government agencies, they also mirror thresholds that were proposed in a more comprehensive procurement reform measure addressed by the previous legislature. I thank the Guam Department of Education and the Guam Housing Urban Renewal Authority for registering their concerns with the current outdated small purchase threshold. Mr. Speaker, if I may, I'd like to share a brief testimony or summary from the from GURA. It's a testimony from Albert Santos, A&E Manager of GURA. With the rising cost of skilled construction labor, Mr. Santos informs senators that the current $50,000 threshold makes it difficult, if not impossible, for the agency to move forward with small construction projects in a timely manner. Recent projects carried out by GURA, including renovations to a Stumbo gym and the new GPD Central Precinct, are priced significantly higher due primarily to the increasing cost of construction labor. While he's not too concerned about larger projects, Mr. Santos is seriously worried about GURA's ability to renovate and repair housing units through small contracts, as contractors have no choice but to increase their labor costs because they're competing with larger companies that offer workers better pay. Moreover, the competitive labor market makes it difficult for the agency to complete small projects such as the removal and replacement of water pipes and electrical systems in a timely manner. Mr. Santos advised the panel that such a situation affects GURA's ability to receive subsidies by U.S. HUD, as their units remain vacant for larger or longer periods of time due to delays associated with securing contractors. So, Mr. Speaker, Bill 59, or Bill 49, as substituted, addresses concerns raised by our agencies, recognizes the fact that the cost of supplies, services, constructions have increased substantially over the years. I wish to thank Attorney John Thomas Brown, GSA, GURA, and DOA. I thank the Chairman and his office for working closely with my team to move Bill 49 forward. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity to speak on Bill 49.
On the main motion, Bill 49-34, Senator Ada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of Bill 49-34. And actually, it's long overdue to make this particular change. And we're changing it from what was before a $15,000 limit for supplies and services. Now it's being raised to $25,000. And we are changing the small purchase threshold for construction from what is currently $50,000 up to $100,000. Interestingly enough, when GURA came in, their chief engineer, he indicated that a lot of their projects was probably on average of about $150,000. So I posed to him the question about, well, would you suggest that then we increase the threshold for construction services up to $150,000? And with that, his response was that really the $100,000 is sufficient. Now, we should keep in mind, of course, that with small purchases, a competitive process is still needed. What that means is that however the agency decides to try and gather at the minimum 3 affirmative quotations, and when I say affirmative, you can't, the agency can't say, well, I called 3 companies and 2 of them never got back and only 1 came back, and so therefore this is the purchase should go to them. Instead, the law is very clear. In fact, no, the regulations is very clear that you've got to get 3 affirmative quotations. So it does facilitate through the small purchase option to be able to facilitate the procurement of supplies and services and for construction services by basically, not having, if you really needed to get out there, you don't have to go, there's that waiting period before you can get an ad into the paper and all that stuff. So if it's really needed, but the bottom line is that the competitive aspect of procurement still remains, and it's just less cumbersome to be able to then implement the small purchase option. But certainly the increasing the threshold is a good move, and I fully support it. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
On the main motion, any other, Senator Nicholas, and then any other senator wish to be heard after Senator Nicholas? Senator Nicholas, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise with some concerns with respect to this bill. Basically, what we're doing with this bill is we're saying that for any $25,000 or less purchase of supplies, or any $100,000 or less purchase for construction, all we got to do is go out and get 3 quotes, and that's a little broad for me. And the reason why is because I think back to when I bought my first house. Gosh, that was 12 years ago. 12 years ago. I remember because my wife and I, in lieu of a honeymoon, we said, let's go buy a house. And back then, the real estate market was, much lower. And we were able to get a little, a nice little place for $125,000. And, I put that into perspective with what we have here in this bill, because what this bill would allow for is technically, that's $100,000 for construction, $25,000 for supplies. We could have built our house. That's a lot of money, $125,000. And if we're going to be relaxing the competitive bid requirements so that all it's going to require is 3 quotes in order to incur that kind of an expense, I'm a little concerned about that. And the reason is because right now, if it's in excess of $50,000 for construction, or I believe $5,000 for a small purchase, you have to go out and you have to bid. You have to put it out for bid, and those come in sealed. And so when the bids come in, and nobody knows what everybody's offering until everyone's in the room and they open up the packages, then we can see what the true competitive price was that was submitted under seal. With the 3 quotes process, you got one person making a phone call, hey, how much for, this kind of work? Fax it in, And so you get 1 fax in, you get 2 faxes in, you get 3 faxes in. You can basically see what the offers are, and there's a potential for there to be some impropriety in terms of, calling up your friend at such and such space, your favorite contractor, the guy who built you your own house, or whatever. There's potential there for some manipulation. And that's the whole reason why we have a rather cumbersome bidding process, is to ensure the process is fair. What we're doing now is we're allowing for up to $125,000, because I don't even know if it's, if you can commingle the supplies and the construction. But we're allowing for amounts that large to be expensed on a 3-quote type of process rather than a competitive bid or a sealed bid process. And then you run into the other potential problem, Mr. Speaker, and I know that it's written here under existing law, and it says that procurement requirements shall not be artificially divided so as to constitute a small purchase under this section. But, that's that can be loosely interpreted, where we can know that we have a phase 1 and a phase 2 and a phase 3, and phase 3 is, and altogether it'll probably cost $300,000 in construction, but put away phase 2, put away phase 3, we're just going to focus on phase 1. And is that artificially divided? Is it not to fit under the small purchase sections? That's difficult to call. It could be challenged. It could be found that no, they did not firmly commit to a phase 2 and a phase 3, so technically they can go about doing it this way. But all of a sudden we have a 3-phase project that would have cost $300,000, that instead of going out and bidding, we instead made it be a $100,000 project 3 times. That's a possibility, because how you define artificially dividing something, that's open to some very creative attorneys. So I'm concerned, Mr. Speaker. I'm concerned that raising this threshold amount would make the process less competitive, and it may result in us getting higher prices for things that we probably would have paid a lot less for if we were getting sealed bids. And the reason why I know this is because I had an opportunity to work for a company that did a government bid. And I remember it was a procurement for one of our autonomous agencies for a chipper, like a wood chipper. And in my capacity, my job was to go out and find the chipper to put together for the bid package. And when we opened those bids, prices were all over the map. We had a chipper that was $15,000, one that was around $10,000, one that was around $4,000. All of them met the specification, But if you were going out and getting quotes and seeing those amounts, and then you had your friend at company X or your primo at company Y or whatever, you can manipulate the outcome of that process. In that chipper example, we didn't win. Somebody else did. I think it was by like $500 or something. But that's how competitive bids work. The offers come in, you open it up, and nobody knows what's being put out there until the time comes for us to be able to make the purchase. So I do have concerns of this bill. I think that it opens it up too much. And while I do agree that we have a very cumbersome procurement process that I know a lot of our colleagues in here are working very hard to fix, I don't know if this is the way we should do it. So I have serious reservations about Bill 49-34. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Madam Vice Speaker, did I see your hand go up? So you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the concerns of the previous speaker. It's always been a concern of mine on small purchases that really the only requirement is that you call up 3 people, you ask them for quotes. And there's no other rule as to which 3 people you pick to call. And so foreseeably, an agency could call the same 3 businesses, although 6 businesses in this particular industry exist. And of course, that limits competition. Now, I also know that the whole point of this small purchases exception to the regular competition is because we consider these amounts small. And listening to Guam Housing, and Gura's testimony, it was apparent, even GSA considers that this amount we are proposing today is still small. In my personal experience, it doesn't sound that small to me because I'm thinking about particularly supplies and services, and small businesses make their living on the, businesses purchasing, I think quite often in amounts less than $25,000. I don't think it's very common that agencies purchase all their supplies, in bulk, in advance, and that they do this quite often as it is needed. And so it's foreseeable that there are quite a few purchases that will be covered under these new amounts. I was convinced by the testimony that the raising from $50,000 to $100,000 for construction, particularly for certain agencies, might be reasonable at this point in time. I'm still a little concerned about this $25,000 for supplies and services, just because I think there is a lot of competition in those markets, and that we should be pushing that. So this is a change to the law, and the law that currently exists was very general, and it said that for small purchases under these amounts, they shall be made in accordance with the procedures promulgated by the policy office, and that they shall not artificially be divided so as to constitute a small purchase under this section. This is another part that I think a lot of people on Guam are suspicious about. It's very hard, I think, for GSA to go in there and prove the opposite, that you had artificially divided it. And that would, I don't even think that GSA has the resources at this point, when they are swamped with keeping up with procurements, to really review this. But I would perhaps, there may be an audit, if I recall, on small purchases that might shed some light on that. But I just think it was part of the testimony that really the only recourse we would have is an after-the-fact audit of small purchases for a year, or whatever period perhaps, and then then somebody might say, oh, it looks like it was artificially divided, or after the fact could say, they really only go to the same 3 small companies. It's not really facilitating competition with all the small businesses in this industry. And but I understand that those are more the policy and the rules that the procurement office, the policy office, needs to establish. So. I was going to address the rules that go along with this, because the policy office, they have its promulgated rules and regs already, and in the original bill, the rules and regs were also in the bill and being amended to reflect these amounts. And I thought that was efficient, because they would not have to come back through the AAA to change the rules and regs to reflect these new amounts that we have now adopted by statute. Although, yeah, the statute would prevail and they would be mandated to change their amounts. But I think there's argument that they would have to do that through the AAA, which we know would take some time for them. So I was going to suggest to the author or inquire, I would propose that if we're going to adopt these new amounts, that we just adopt them into the rules and regulations as well, so that they don't have to come back and re-promulgate the rules and regs to reflect these higher amounts. And that would affect 5 section of the rules and regs, and I have them printed out and I can pass it out. Where it currently says 15,000, we would cross that out and place 25,000 for supplies and services. And where it currently says 50,000, we would strike that out and put 100,000 for construction in the rules and regs themselves. So I would make copies of these, but I just wanted to draw the attention of my colleagues, similar to the previous speaker, to the current rules and regs, and that really their only requirement is that we are going to ask 3 people. And we put a lot of faith in our agencies that they are not trying to bypass the competitive, but competitive really is the basis of our procurement system. And if we can't get these companies to be competitive, that results in the government of Guam spending more than it should, and results in the feeling of the public that they can't trust us to, do it without favoritism or things like that. And so anyways, Mr. Speaker, so I would like to make that amendment to change the rules and regs and to where they say 25,000 for supplies, 15 for supplies, to change it to 25,000 for supplies and services, and where it says 50,000 to change it to 100,000 for construction.
On the amendment, Senator Haddock.
Mr. Speaker, I have serious concerns about the amendment that's being made to actually go in there and now actually amend the procurement regulations, which falls really under the purview of the policy office, which is not just a GSA function. It is the governor appoints the people to sit on that group, and they're the ones that actually make the rules and regulations. So the concern that I have is then when we go inside the rules and regs then and start tinkering, then we run that real fine line between now we're on the one hand, when we pass legislation, we're setting policy, and then at the same time, what we're trying to do with the amendment that's being proposed is we're going to go in there and tell the executive branch how to do it and all that when we start getting into the rules and regs. And I think we should just stay with the legislation, establishing by legislation what these thresholds are. And it doesn't, the only thing that's inconsistent when we do that is that in the rules and regs, the lower threshold figures remain, but otherwise all the implementing procedures remain the same. So to steer away from any possible conflict, that somebody's going to come back and say no, now this, like throw out this separation of power issue and all that stuff. Let's just establish a threshold in the legislation, and whenever there's a conflict between the two, then of course legislation will supersede that. So I would have to object to the amendment of going into the rules and regs and making those changes there. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Morrison, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the previous speaker. We did acknowledge that in the rules, and my understanding too is the law affects the rules, and eventually that is what I believe. And any change, even bringing it up with Attorney Brown in our discussions, to specify what the rules change. I think that's an act that would be handled by the agency or at the agency level, and I think that's believed to in line with the previous speaker. So I just want to make that noted that we did bring this up. Even when we first drafted the legislation, that was our initial draft. And speaking with stakeholders, that was the route we took. My understanding too is the law would eventually effectuate, or the rules will have to comply with the law. Thank you.
Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just wanted to point out something very interesting, and I guess this is one of those real, it's the real fun part of being able to look at law very carefully. So what we're doing with this bill is we're saying that any procurement not exceeding $25,000 for supplies or services and not exceeding $100,000 for construction may be made in accordance with small purchase procedures promulgated by the policy office. And so at least how do I interpret that? The way I interpret that is we're saying by law it may not exceed 25,000 or 100,000, but if the rules and regs still say 15 and 50, then that's what they're still limiting it to. And so I don't think that an amendment to the rules and regs is necessary, but I also don't think that the failure to amend that means that this now changes those figures arbitrarily. Because the way this is written is it says any procurement not exceeding. So we just raise the ceiling, but we still authorize the policy office to set the procedures and to promulgate it. And so if the ceiling is 25, but they don't change the rules and regs and they keep it at 15, then while this law does allow for a greater flexibility, it would be up to the policy office to change the rules and regs to make that flexibility available. If we do go in and do it as a direct amendment to the rules and regs, I think that that's something that we could possibly do. I'm not quite sure about the separation of powers question at that point, but I don't think that the amounts in the rules and regs being lower than the amounts in this bill are necessarily in conflict. I think that this bill would just create a greater threshold, but the rules and regs will still technically govern how those procedures are promulgated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any other senator wish to be heard on the amendment? There's been an objection to the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Amendment fails. We're back to the main motion. Oh, you still wish the floor. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The effective date of this bill is 180 days after enactment, so perhaps that is enough time for GSA and all the other procuring authorities to purchasing agencies to...
Point of information, Mr. Speaker. The original bill as introduced was to have an effective date of 180 days after. The bill as amended or as substituted makes the effective date upon enactment.
Thank you. The one that's in the blue folder has upon enactment.
Oh. All right. Are there one or two versions substituted by the committee? I think the one we had at our public hearing most recently, substituted by committee. Okay, had that effective date. So now it's effective upon enactment? All right. I would also like to make an amendment, Mr. Speaker, that small purchases, the use of this provision that by GSA or any other purchasing agency be reported on a monthly basis to GSA so that we can quickly ascertain its effects. I don't have it in writing, Mr. Speaker, but it would be that the chief procurement, officer, director of public works, or the head of a purchasing agency making a purchase pursuant to this section shall report such purchases on a monthly basis to the Speaker of the Guam Legislature. What I would like to see, Mr. Speaker, is the 3 solicitations that each agency is utilizing, who they are soliciting from for these types of the 3 solicitations. All of these are supposed to be in their procurement record, so I would just like a report of those monthly. We're creating an exception for them, so I think.
Are you proposing an amendment?
Yes.
And the amendment would
My amendment, Mr. Speaker, was that the Chief Procurement Officer, the Director of Public Works, or the head of a purchasing agency utilizing this section shall report to the Speaker of the Guam Legislature monthly as to procurements pursuant to this section.
Senator Aga?
Mr. Speaker, I have some concerns with adding that additional requirement to the agencies. First of all, let's not overlook the fact that in our procurement law, the protest feature is available, and that's the self-policing mechanism in our procurement system. So obviously, if this so-called scenario of this buyer picks up the phone and calls his 3 buddies all of the time, and there's the 4th, 5th, and 6th company that can also make the same supplies and services available, before long, he's going to be asking questions about, hey, how come my prices are smaller? I'm always, have the things on stock, but I never get called. And then those are the sort of things that then will trigger a protest, certainly will trigger visits to senatorial offices saying something doesn't pass the smell test, please look into it. But, to add on the requirement of, again, another report, I guess it won't hurt. It's just, get so many reports. I'm not sure everybody really reads it, but do we really need to put on that additional burden again? I think maybe I'm too trusting. Maybe that's my problem. And that I believe that the buyers out there in the agencies are actually acting in good faith to procure services and materials in as timely a manner as possible, and will do their work right. Yeah, you're going to have a few slick ones, but for the most part, I think most of them do well for the people. And so I just, it's nothing fatal. It's just, again, every time you go to the bathroom, I want to report. So I just have some concerns about that.
Any other Senator Nicholas?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to suggest perhaps an amendment to the amendment, because if we're just going to be having a report coming in on all the small purchases, that's a lot of small purchases. I think that perhaps we should narrow the scope of the report to any purchases that are made within that new gap that's being provided. So any purchases that exceed $15,000 should be reported as a part of the measure. Only because all those other things that are current practice, we may be getting reams and reams of paper clips and pencils and all those other small purchases. And so perhaps we should narrow the scope of the amendment so that it only applies to small purchases in excess of $15,000 and construction services in excess of $50,000, because those will be the new services that would be procured with the passage of this act. So I just wanted to rise and make that recommendation to the author.
On that amendment, to the amendment, anybody wish to be heard?
Mr. Speaker, it's not a 1 or 2 or 3 word amendment, and there's been an amendment to that amendment. Can we see that in writing, please?
It's 20 to 12. Would the two of you get together on an amendment? We'll deal with it at 2 o'clock. Thank you. We stand in recess.